All right, what's good, everybody? It's your boy Blackbeard. We most certainly are back in the masjid of truth and higher learning. Nice to have the ladies and gentlemen here on this Friday night. So the subject of this tape, we'll look into some of the history of medieval Europe. We're going to look into the history of medieval Europe and look at some of the conditions and backgrounds and environments that the Moorish nobility, the Moorish upper and middle class of Europa were living in the, we'll say, about 700s AD up until about the 1700s AD. And how these, rough and negative, diseased, wicked environments forced them to have to abandon a lot of their kingdoms. So in prior tapes, I've talked about us in America having ancestry from not only the indigenous American population, but also some of the European population who were people of color that came to the Americas and populated what we call the 13 colonies. Because not only were the 13 colonies, those charters, not only were they created, and not only was the money put up and financed and the leases of the land, not only were all those business transactions done by Moorish or so-called black kings, but the citizens and the people who came to live on that land that was now leased to those European kings were also people of color. So when we talk about the original people of England, the Welsh, the Scots, the Brits, the Celts, the Franks, the Swedes, the Germans, and the other various European countries, when those people initially came here, they were so-called black people. All right. They were so-called black people. And they had what's known as we'll call Christendom culture. OK, so we're going to look into just some of the things that they had to deal with. All right. Now, I'm going to come out of a variety of sources. I'm coming out of 3 books primarily tonight. We're coming out of one book called Dirt, A Social History as Seen Through the Uses and Abuses of Dirt by Terrence P. McLaughlin. All right. The book is called Dirt, A Social History as Seen Through the Uses and Abuses of Dirt by Terrence P. McLaughlin. We're going to come out of my book that I wrote called America, a Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent. America, a Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent. And the final book we'll read is called The Negro Question Part 6, The 13 Black Colonies by Lee Cummings. The Negro Question Part 6, The 13 Black Colonies by Lee Cummings. A lot of the photos and images that we're going to see tonight of these original Scots, etc., are coming from that book, The Negro Question by Lee Cummings. All right. So we got a variety of sources, and tonight should be a good tape, and we should learn a lot. So to pop this off, one of the things that took place in Europe were not only a lot of ethnic cleansing because there were wars, but also a lot of plague, disease, virus, etc., sickness. All right. So we're going to look into the history of the lepers. All right. Now, who are the lepers? A lot of us are told in modern history that, quote unquote, pale European Caucasian people had their start in Europe. But that is not true. They actually traveled into what we call Europe from the east, or what we call Asia Minor. All right. So a lot of their origins started in Asia Minor, and they traveled into what we called Europa. And when they traveled into West Europa, they ran into what's known as the Moorish Byzantine Orthodox Christian Empire. And they had a lot of conflict with those people. And as they continued to travel west, they ran into the Moorish Empire of the United Kingdom. And they ran into also the Moorish Empire in the south of Iberia, all right, in Northwest Africa. And when these people came into Europa, they brought a lot of disease and plague with them because they lived in a lot of woodland and forest conditions, all right. Now, before I move forward, I'm not saying any of this to try to attack so-called white people. All this is just history, you all, okay? But when we research history, if you type in whether it's Google or any other thing, I just didn't have the time to get a picture. But if you type in the wild men of Europe, you clearly will get a picture of people who were living in the forest. Their bodies were covered in hair. They had very, very long nails. They had very long toenails. They had blonde and they had red hair. They had blue and green eyes, and they had pale skin. So these are the ancestors of modern day, quote unquote, white people or Caucasian people. And they are also known historically and in literature sometimes as the Germanic tribes. You'll see them named that as well. But nevertheless, they were living in the forest. They were living in the woods. They were a nomadic people. And they were used to living among animals, and their immune systems and their bodies and their blood had gotten used to living in certain, we'll call unsanitary natural environments. All right. They were used to living with the animals and things of this nature. All right. Also think about, during the times of the winter, in order to keep themselves warm, they will wear certain animal skins, and these animal skins and their hair, it would attract things like lice and fleas, etc. So through these living conditions after year, when they started to invade into Europa and they came across these Moorish Christian kingdoms, their plagues and their diseases and their viruses came with them. And believe it or not, these viruses took out majority of those populations. So when you take the religious wars and the infighting that the Moorish kingdoms in Europe had, such as the 100 Years' War, that's a war we'll visit tonight, the War of 1812, basically those wars between England and France, that's an ancient war. When you take into account those wars, and when you take into account a lot of the virus and disease that was brought into Europe, this is what decreased a lot of the melanated populations of Europe. And this is what forced a lot of them to want to relocate and create a new life and create a new civilization for themselves and basically start over here in the Americas. All right. So let's go into this book, Dirt, first. We're going to do some reading and see what we can come up with. Right now, we're going to go into the history of the lepers. Cleanliness and urbanity go together. The Moorish Romans were clean mainly because they set great value on public and collective life. If a man is going to spend most of his time talking, debating, working in close proximity to other people, he can do this with more grace and less distraction if the smell and appearance of his face and body do not offend his neighbors. So before we move forward, I just want you to understand that people of color, indigenous people, a lot of our civilizations, kingdoms, and empires, we were very, very sanitary and wanted clean environments. We were always used to taking baths, wearing deodorants, brushing our teeth. We were doing these types of things in the ancient world, washing our hair, sweeping and making sure the streets were clean. I can remember researching in certain books. And when the Spaniard conquistadors first arrived in the Americas, they were very, very astonished, and they recorded how the different indigenous kingdoms and people they came across would sweep the streets and keep the environment very, very clean. So this is how we were living. And the original, as we talked about, we talked about before, the original Romans, or what the original Roman culture, a lot of that was taken from Carthage. OK, so Romans' understanding of bathhouses and things like that, a lot of that they took from Carthage. So this culture was taken into Europa. All right. But when these invaders came in from the forest and from the woods, they necessarily were not used to living in urban environments. They were used to living in more, we'll call, wild environments. So while we were living in kingdoms and empires with pyramids, mounds, and cities and communities and stuff like that, neighborhoods, bathhouses, bathrooms, people were washing their hands. We had soap. While we were living like that, these invaders were not living that way. All right. So let's see what they started to do when they came into Europe. This same urbanity and interest in social life was anathema to the rising cult of the Christians. And these rising Christians are these pale Caucasian people who were coming from the forest and converting into Christianity when they came into Europe. Who were firmly convinced that the things of this world were vanities, and they tended to reject all the other Roman values, including cleanliness, along with the theological ones. They seriously renounced the business and pleasures of the age, abjured the use of wine, of flesh, and of marriage, chastised their bodies, mortified their affections, and embraced a life of misery as the price of eternal happiness, remarks Gibbon, picking over the wretched habits of the early Christians with the formidable scalpel of his prose. Now, before we move forward, I want you to understand that when these wild forest people came into Europe and they kicked out a lot of our people, they started to adopt the Christian culture that they saw the Moorish kingdom people, the Moorish civilizations practice. But they came with more of a forest Christian culture, a forest woodland Christian Caucasian culture. So it's not going to be the same in its original form. All right, let's move forward. It says that where we at? All right, here we are right here. Excuse me. Now, let me say this too before we move forward. Now, remember, the original Moorish Christendom were so-called black people. But then the wild people from the forest came in and they created their own Christendom. So you got to remember, if I may say the king of the Scots, there was a Moorish one. And then later on, there was a Caucasian one. If I say the king of the French, there was a Moorish one. And later on, there was a Caucasian one. If I say Edward III, there was a Moorish one. And later on in history, there was a written in Caucasian one. If I say King James VI, there was a Moorish one. And later on in history, there was a written in Caucasian one. So remember, they came in and they stole the Moorish European Christian history and just rewrote it as themselves in literature. I just wanted to say that so you won't get confused when I start naming certain people. OK, let's keep it going. Let's move. All right. So it says. All right. Saint Benedict, one of the greatest administrators of the early church, pronounced solemnly that to those that are well, and especially to the young, bathing shall seldom be permitted. And his followers accepted the prohibition with great zeal. Saint Agnes was never washed throughout her lifetime. The fact that the lifetime was only 13 years may have had some connection with this. And a 4th century pilgrim to Jerusalem boasted that she had not washed her face for 18 years, so as not to disturb the holy water used at her baptism. So what I'm reading right here is when these forests and these wild people came into Europe, they took on a Christian culture. They looked at everything that was a cleanliness as a type of a vanity. So they would punish themselves, trying to be noble and just. This is something that they had to go through for their own genetics because of the background that they came from. So they had a mindset that taking a bath and being clean is a sign of evil. So the more dirty you were, the more holy you were. So when these original Caucasian Christians were baptized and you know, their face was washed with holy water, these people would not wash their face after that for years, just so they wouldn't disturb that quote unquote blessing from their baptism. This is the way that they thought. Let's read deeper. It says, Saint Agnes throughout her lifetime had never bathed. Then it went on to say that a 4th century pilgrim to Jerusalem boasted that she hadn't washed her face for 18 years. Saint Jerome criticized some of his followers for keeping too clean. Once again, I'm reading to y'all about the Caucasian people. This is their history right here. Many of the ascetics went further than simple neglect of their own bodies and sought out lepers, sufferers from ulcers, and other people with more disgusting and dirty diseases, so as to give the ascetic the chance to wash ulcered feet with his own hair in the style of Saint Mary Magdalene, to kiss leprous or ulcered skin, and generally wallow in the perverse delights of coprophilia. So right here, we're going into the history of the leper. Now, think about in Shemitic culture where the leper or the person who, you know, whose skin starts to bleach, these people will be cast out of the society. All right. You can read about this in the Old Testament, you know, for you all, you know, want to get more insight on that. So these lepers that were cast out of society, they started to basically create groups and create communities amongst each other. So they started to, let's say, put on a pedestal their attributes and their traits, such as the boils and the other things that the leper experiences. So as it said right here, it said that many of the aesthetics went further than simple neglect of their own body and sought out lepers, sufferers from ulcers, and other people with the more disgusting and dirty diseases, so as to give the ascetic the chance to wash ulcered feet with his own hair, in the style of Saint Mary Magdalene, to kiss leprous or ulcered skin, and generally wallow in the perverse delights of coprophilia. It is a pity that they did not try, while giving themselves such strange enjoyment, to use any practical means of relieving the suffering of the patients. St. Hugh of Lincoln used to gather together a great assembly of male lepers and then kiss them, reserving his fondest and closest embraces for those who were the most deformed, and taking care to kiss the actual ulcers on their skin. So when these pale people were coming into Europe and adopting this Christian culture, since they were the lepers, they had a total different mindset about the leper. Let's move forward. It says here, going into the Caucasian Queen Matilda, it says, Queen Matilda surprised her brother David by her unusual devotions. When he was serving as a youth at the English court, the Caucasian English court, one evening he was with his companions in the lodgings. When the queen called him to her chamber, he found the place full of lepers, and the queen standing in the midst with her robe laid aside and a towel girt round her. Having filled a basin with water, she proceeded to wash the feet of the lepers and to wipe them with the towel, and then taking them in both her hands, she kissed them with devotion. To whom her brother, quote, Why dost thou, my lady? Certes, if the king were to know this, never would he want to kiss with his lips that mouth of thine polluted with the soil of leprous feet. But she answered with a smile, Who does not know that the feet of an eternal king are to be preferred to the lips of a mortal king? See then, dearest brother, wherefore I have called thee, that thou mayest learn by my example to do so also. So as you can see right here, this, Caucasian queen had a room full of lepers, and she was washing them and kissing their leprous feet. And her brother came in and saw this, and he said, sister, what are you doing? If your husband knew you were doing this, he would never want to kiss you again. And her reply is basically that I'd rather kiss these men's feet than kiss his. Let's move forward. It says, leprosy had come from Egypt with the Roman soldiers, a more permanent prize than Cleopatra. It appeared as a skin complaint in which small patches of the skin seemed to lose all feeling, so that pins could be stuck into them without any sensation of pain. Listen closely, you all. Listen very close to this. The spots turned pale gray or white, and larger areas of the body began to suffer from the same anesthesia. Then some of the patches turned into sores, and eventually large open ulcers producing a continuous stream of pus. The hands and feet became deformed and sponge-like, and the nose was often affected, so that continuous sneezing and finally suffocation resulted. It was a disease aptly called the living death. So this leper, you know what I'm saying? This is the leper history, y'all. Where we gonna go now? And basically what it does is, right here, it just goes deeper into how when they created their own form of Christ, he basically, admired the leper. Now we're going to go to our next page. All right. Plague is still a mystery disease, still difficult to cure and still terrifying. It is sudden, lethal, and horrible in its symptoms, reducing its victims to a stinking carrion even before they are dead. It seems to ebb and flow across the world like a destroying tide. Now listen very close to this, you all. Now remember earlier when I said that this plague and these viruses and what we know of as the Bubonic Plague, how it came from the east, and how these wild forest people who were living in the woods with animals, how they came from the east into Europe. Listen close. The diseases seem to have receded in Europe until the Black Death, which started again in Central Asia in 1338 and 1389, and again spread westward. It traveled through the Mediterranean countries swiftly and was brought to England in 1348. So I just want you to understand that these diseases came from the east and they traveled west. All right. Came from the east and traveled west. Now, remember I talked about Edward III. The original Edward III was a Moorish, or he was a melanated man. OK, so during that 100 Years' War, the King of England and the King of France, they were still melanated men. Although you had certain peasants and certain serfs who were Caucasian living in Europe at this time. It said that plague spread rapidly in England and was recorded in the north by 1349 and passed Aberdeen by the end of that year. It waxed and waned, reappearing in 1361 to 1362 in a form almost as deadly as the Black Death. Then in large epidemics in 1368, 1369, 1375, 1390, 1391, 1406, 1407, 1464, 1479, 1500, 1513, 1563, 1569, 1593, 1610, 1625, and the famous Great Black Plague of 1665. So most of us are familiar with the Black Plague of 1665, but it had been around for hundreds of years prior to that. Let's move forward. Now listen up. Plague is carried by fleas, which in turn are passengers on rats and rodents. But what I want you to understand is that they're carried by fleas, but the humans are carrying the fleas. So a lot of this stuff is written as if the rodents and the rats are what was carrying the Black Plague, and it was traveling around Europe that fast. But think about this, you all. How was some rats coming from the Far East traveling around Europe that fast? The rats are getting on boats. How are they that organized to transfer the disease that fast throughout Europa? The only way it could have spread that fast, it had to have been through human contact, you all. So it was human contact that spread those diseases so fast throughout Europa. Let's move forward. So let's look at, some of these conditions after these deaths were taking place by these diseases. Because as I said, a lot of the people of color in the Moorish Christendom kingdoms were destroyed because of these viruses and these diseases. As the sick began to outnumber the well, the deadly bodies became too numerous to dispose of with any of the traditional decencies. So what happened was this Black Death was destroying and killing so many Moorish Europeans that the bodies were just piling up. They had to try to burn these bodies, put them in wells. They were starting to run out of room. And you literally had rats eating on flesh in the streets and all type of wild barbarism taking place. So this is the kind of hellhole and hellfire that Europe had turned into. And a lot of the nobles and people that had resources, they got the hell on up out of there. And then when all these cities were evacuated by these people of color, then you have those forest wild people come in. Their immune systems and their bloodstream and their flesh is already adapted to those diseases because they were in the forest with them. So now they just start living in these communities. A lot of the homes are abandoned. They take the clothes that's in the homes And they just start living in these communities now. But they were once lived in, controlled by people of color. But a lot of the people of color had died or they left. So it says grave diggers and caretakers carry the corpses could only be recruited from the class with nothing to lose, criminals, vagabonds, and beggars. And they made the best use of their opportunities to rob not only the corpses, but any house to which the sickness had penetrated, knowing well that no neighbors or officials would dare to enter such a house to interfere. These ghouls soon became almost as much as object of fear as the plague itself. They were reputed in particular to rape any moderately attractive female in the stricken houses, whether alive, dying, or already dead, and terrifying stories of this are retailed by most of the authors on plague with a consciousness shock tone. So what you had right here is like I was saying, like a lot of these people, they were used to these diseases. So a lot of these grave diggers, they came from the class of the vagabonds, the beggars, and the criminals. And these people were allowed to go in cities and clean out the dead bodies and clean out the remnant of the Black Death. But while they went in these cities, they basically were in there stealing stuff, raping people, and doing all a bunch of wild, crazy shit. This is some of the shit that was going on in Europe and what made them want to get the hell out of there. Because I'm just going into, why so many of them came to the Americas. So what we're about to do now is we're going to get ready to transition into another book. But we're going to look into how not only the diseases, but a lot of political and propaganda was put out about King James, the Stewart line, and a lot of the Moorish Scots who were still ruling in the British Isles. Okay. So Western Europe, a lot of the Moorish kingdoms in Western Europe, they weren't fully destroyed until the early 1900s. So it took a while to do a good ethnic cleansing of the Moorish nobility of Western Europe until about, the early 1900s. And one of the prominent men that a lot of people, from my research, I see a lot of negative propaganda about him is King James. Now, was this man more than likely a perfect person? No. Did he make mistakes in his life? I'm sure he did. But I just see a lot of stuff written about him. And, I know a lot of it is propaganda, more so based on the culture and the type of kingdom that he wanted to establish. For one, he was against, the Catholic Church. And for two, he wanted to resurrect more of a Israelite type of culture. There was one man in particular named Anthony Weldon. Let's briefly read about him before I go into my book. Sir Anthony Weldon, who wrote his account of the king, published in 1650 for private circulation, was no friend of the Stewarts. He had been knighted by King James when he succeeded his father as clerk of the Green Cloth, but dismissed after writing a scurrilous account of Scotland, by implication an insult on the King of Scots himself. But on the other hand, many of his strictures on James are repeated by other observers. So there was this guy named Sir Anthony Weldon, and he's a melanated man because I've seen a picture of him. But I guess he was working with King James, but through some of, his literature and things that he wrote, King James didn't agree with it, and he chose to stop dealing with the man. So because of that, he created a lot of negative information about King James and put it into the public. So a lot of these accounts about King James being a homosexual and a lot of that type of stuff, that was put out by that guy. Now let's go into my book real quick and let's briefly read about these Stewarts. In 1340, Edward III asked for Venetian backing in an all-out onslaught against France, and with support from the Doge. Edward the Egghead marches to bring hail. Robin Hood and King Arthur and the Round Table were Venetian-inspired stories to appease the egos of elite and poor English. Remember, it was two types of people living in England. You had the melanated elite and middle class, and you had the poor serfs. All right. Poor oppressed people should always covet what elitists have and be willing to kill and steal for it. And wealthy classes need not to worry about the lives that would be lost in their idiotic, insane adventures. In 1381, displeased serfs confronted the King Richard II about tight taxes in England's system of serfdom/slavery that dictated where the serf worked, giving him no economic liberties. The Peasants' Revolt broke out where governmental records were burned, political figures were murdered, and raids for food forced Richard II to meet with the mob. After negotiations failed, rebels were decapitated and harsher restrictions fell on poor whites. Hundreds of thousands died from starvation, the Black Death, and religious lunacy. So right here, I'm just briefly reading and going into how the serf or the Caucasian pale class of Europe were tired and were griping with King Richard II, who was a melanated black king. And they were trying to get, better, economic contracts for the, work they were doing. And really these, Moorish kings were lying to them. So these Caucasian serfs said, we tired of this shit. And they just revolted. And that's historically recorded as the Peasants' Revolt. They were mad about the taxes and things like that. And they revolted. James Charles Stewart was the son of Mary Stewart I of Scotland and was born the summer of 1566. He was also a descendant to the throne of England and Ireland, making Moorish King James one of the most powerful men in history. James's reign is labeled the Jacobean era, and rightfully so, being he reunified northern Hebrew tribes of Europa as the United Kingdom of Jacob. The British Celts were of Moorish Shemitic origins, sons and daughters of Isaac, or original Angles and Saxons. James Stewart was educated in ancient Hebraic sciences and did not answer to the Pope, but to the true unseen God of creation. King James organized a project to restore a new Hebrew Bible that will include missing texts subtracted by Venetian conspirators. Charles Stewart was widely accepted as an English scholar with his revised 1611 masterpiece. By reuniting the nation of Jacob, King James positioned himself to realign with Moorish Amaru Hebrew dynastic families in America. So that's just some real brief history into King James, So what we're going to do right now is go through a variety of pictures and look at King James's family and some of the nobles that actually were before him. All right. So the first one we start with that you see on this page, this is the King of the Scots, Alexander II, dating to 1198 AD. And as you can see, he's a melanated man. All right. So-called black man. Look at the ethnic features. He was the king of the Scots in 1198. All right. Right here we have a picture of Robert Bruce I, King of Scots Highlander, 1274 to 1329. All right. This is a skull image of King Robert the Bruce, or Bruiser. The name Bruce in Paleo Hebrew means bruiser, so Robert's real name was Robert the Bruiser. The reason that I am using Robert the Bruce's skull is because the wide nasal passage proves that he was indeed a black man. Robert the Bruce was a black Scottish king, and he was the ancestor of King James VI of Scotland, the King James that translated Big Mama's Bible. Robert the Bruce was also a Highlander. His skull and his black image matches the verbal map given to us by Professor Boyd Dawkins. So this is Robert the Bruiser, one of the ancestors of King James. And as you can see his features right here. All right. So, a lot of the way that you can prove who were these nobles and these kings and queens and emperors of these ancient empires is they look at these skulls and they look at the nose structure, the eyebrows, the skull, the mouth, and they take all these various characteristics and they determine who in the human family does this belong to. So this is also why, melanated people, they put out propaganda and try to make you feel shameful about your natural traits, like such as the black face, where they were trying to make fun of our noses or, make fun of our lips or something like that. All right. But just know that these are actually the king characteristics. All right. Right here, we have a picture of King Matthew Stewart IV, Earl of Lennox, 1516 to 1571. He was the grandfather of King James. So this is the grandfather of King James. Clearly, you can see he's a so-called black man. All right. Grandfather of King James, a Highlander, an original Scot. Right here, we have a picture of King Henry Stewart, father of King James VI of Scotland, 1545 to 1567. This king was known as Lord Henry Stewart, who happened to be the father of King James VI of Scotland and the first of England. When you go to chapter 7 of this book, The Ship's Manifest, you will see that the deported Jacobites were described as brown-skinned, swarthy, dark-skinned, or nut brown. So these were melanated indigenous people, and this is the father of King James. As you can see, a so-called black man, all right? But he's wearing what we call traditional European clothing, Moorish clothing. Right here, we have a picture of King James VI. So this is the son of the man that you just saw, all right? This is an image of Moorish King James VI of Scotland, all right? So this is a picture of him. And as you can see, what is he holding in his hand? He's holding the ball of world dominion, and he's holding the royal scepter. All right. So these are symbols of kingship. Right now, what do we have going on? The NBA Finals. All right. Think about the NBA Finals and think about the Larry O'Brien trophy, that gold NBA trophy. And think about that gold ball that's at the top of the NBA trophy. That is the same ball that you see King James holding. That came from the balls, or these little globes, which represent the world dominion, universal dominion, Christendom, Moorish, Israelite dominion. That's what it's representing. Okay. So, that's the same symbolism with the gold globe, that the conqueror gets in the NBA when they win the championship. And as you can see right here, this is the Holy Bible, which was financed, and this project was put together by King James VI. And he had a variety of, scholars get ancient scripture and basically try to put the Bible back in its original context to the best of their ability. Although by the time they got their hands on it, it had probably been rewritten a bunch of times. And maybe even some of those authors rewrote certain things. OK, but nevertheless, when people wonder, well, who wrote the Bible? They were melanated authors, so-called black men from the ancient world and the medieval world. All right. So that's just a very, very simple, basic answer. Right here, you have King James VI and his wife, Anne of Denmark. And as you can see, this is a melanated woman, Anne of Denmark. All right. So this was the Queen of Scotland. OK, the wife of King James. So a so-called black woman and a so-called black man. All right. Highlanders. Now, right here, it's going to get, it's about to get good. So you remember when I talked about earlier, a lot of those plagues and viruses and a lot of those wars that took place, and it forced a lot of the people of color that were the original European inhabitants. It forced a lot of them to leave. A lot of them went south into what we call the Iberian Peninsula and Northwest Africa. And a lot of them just came to the Americas, and they came and lived in the southeast of North America, and they lived along the eastern seaboard. So the states such as like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, etc., the various states in the Northeast, these are a lot of the areas that they went to. All right. They got a lot of leasing, and they rented that land from certain indigenous American tribes who had, power and control in those areas. They made business contracts. A lot of those families intermarried because they were both people of color. And this is pretty much what happened. So a lot of the various melanated European communities, they were absorbed into the indigenous American communities. And believe it or not, a lot of them started practicing our culture here, just like you had a lot of us practicing European Christian culture. So, just keep that in mind. But as I was saying, right here, who we're looking at is Charles I. Okay. He's a king of Scotland. Charles I. He's actually the son of King James. All right. Charles I. So you can see a melanated man. You can see the beard. Also, Charles I, he had very, very long hair, too. Charles II did as well. Very long hair. So what you all call like a jerry curl that a lot of the melanated Americans wore in the 80s. Some of those Moorish Europeans, they had, that they liked that style, too. And when I looked at Charles I, a lot of his pictures, and Charles II, not only they had very, very long hair, but it looked like jerry curl almost. So that style, believe it or not, came from a lot of the Moorish nobility and upper and middle class of Europa, and they came over here. So our people have, been wearing a lot of different type of little hairstyles. That's all. Here's another picture of Charles I, and actually when he was beheaded in the English Civil War in the 1600s. But in this picture, you can see he has long hair. So, unfortunately, they got the ancestor right there, man, and he was beheaded. But let's move forward. Now, right here, we're about to go into some very, very interesting history. So just keep in mind, this is important right here. So we're going to, talk about this picture, but let's look at it and examine it real quick. So as you can see, this is Charles I, the man that we just looked at. He has on his royal outfit. But as you can see right here, he has the divine An Nur coming out of his eye. Now, in a tape that I made a while ago, I talked about the Hebraic or Islamic secrets of the An Nur, or the divine light. All right. And I talked about how in the Quran, there are verses in scriptures that talk about how the Most High Power wants to see through your eyes. And this is how you have clarity. OK, this is how you have illumination through the eye. So when you see certain spiritual pictures, they'll show a human being and they'll show this divine light coming out of their eye. That divine light that's coming out of their eye that allows them to have, clarity and see truth and to pierce through darkness and pierce through ignorance. That divine light that's coming out of the eye is actually being reflected from their mind. Their mind is reflecting the light from the heart, and the heart is reflecting its light from that divine central sun. That's that divine ocean, really, also that we all have in relation with each other, because God essentially is oneness. All right. So that one we'll call divine supreme ocean that our souls and spirits all originally came from. This is also where that divine light comes from. But as I said also in a tape yesterday, that your heart is seen as the inner sun. OK, so that divine light is coming from your heart, and it should reflect on your mind. And then this, reflects through your eyes. So that's a very, very, occult, esoteric, Hebraic secret right here that Prince James, King James, or his son, rather, Charles I is trying to show us right here. All right. So he's going to give us a lot of secrets in this picture. One of them is that divine light of the An Nur, because Nur in Arabic means light. But he's also going to show us that he has Hebraic ancestry as well, because he's going to record it. All right. So this is a very, very esoteric occult picture. Let's read about it. All right. This is an image of Charles I of Scotland and England. All right. Charles I of Scotland and England. All right. There's just another picture of the An Nur coming out as light, the divine light. Now, this word Mundi Calco, very, very important. We're going to go deeper into what this word means. Mundi Calco, because this is going to help us understand the ancestry, because these kings of Europa and queens, they knew their ancestry and they knew where they came from. So we're going to get a secret unravel to us in a minute. So this picture right here that you see, Mundi Calco, is coming from down here. So on the foot of Charles I, under his foot, he has written Mundi Calco in his picture right here. You see it right here. Here go the whole picture. But down here, Mundi Calco is written on his foot. So now we're going to read, well, what does Mundi Calco mean? I would like to take a moment and focus on the pillow that King Charles I's shoe is resting on. The shoe says Mundi Calco. Mundi was the name of a river in Hibernia or Iberia or Spain, and Calco was a descendant of Judah. You can find the name Calco written in Chronicles 1, chapter 2, verse 6. Why would King Charles have Mundi Calco written on his effigy? History says that Galatheus, the son of Calco, the son of Zara, and the son of Judah, settled in Hibernia near a river called Mundi. The plot further thickens when one realizes that Galatheus named his son Hiber, see Genesis chapter 10, verse 21, being interpreted Hebrew Habara Heber. Heber or Eber was the son of Shem, who was the father of all the Hebrews. These people are maintaining a premise chronicle of their family tree on images and artifacts. Let me repeat that. These people, meaning the Stewarts, are maintaining a precise chronicle of their family tree on images and artifacts. So by him writing Mundi Calco, Prince Charles I is letting us know that he has Hebrew ancestry. Let's read this one more time. It says, I would like to take a moment and focus on the pillow that King Charles I's shoe is resting on. This pillow is where, his foot is on. The shoe says Mundi Calco. Mundi was a name of a river in Spain. So Mundi is a name of a river in Spain. And Calco was a descendant of Judah. So basically there was a descendant of Judah who traveled to Spain or Iberia, southern Europa, and settled near a river named Mundi. So Mundi Calco is showing you that the descendants of Judah or Israel settled or lived in Iberia. So that word Iberia or Hebrew, it's the same word. Okay, so this is where I got that from. This is where I got that from. If you've heard me mention that before. So, just as, before we move forward, that the Stewarts or the Jacobites, the Highlanders of Scotland, were descendants of Eber or Shem. All right. So they were Hebraic or Hebrew. This is why King James wanted to restore more of that ancient Hebrew culture. But he had some battles and some wars with the Catholic Church. All right. Let's move forward. That's his son, Charles II. All right. As you can see, long hair, melanated man. All right. All right, let me find one more page real quick. Y'all just give me a brief moment real quick. Yeah, it's something important I want to get, so we ain't in no rush. I'm just trying to find my page. Just bear with me for a minute. Even pause it, I guess, and go get something to drink or use the bathroom, whatever it is you got to do. We still in this stage. Just give me a real brief moment. Because basically what I'm looking for is it's a page in here. Just because I don't want to waste too much time. But basically what it is that, I mean, you kind of can see it right here a little bit, but just understand that Mundi Calco and the Israelite connection also to the Queen Scotia, all right? And there was a marriage to the Pharaoh's daughter. So that term Scots comes from Scotia, who was a Hamitic, Shemitic queen of Europa. But it was a particular page. I'll find it more than likely, just put it in another tape. Ain't no sweat. But what we're going to do now is get ready to conclude the tape. And I want to show you how King James basically went against the Catholic Church, and they wanted to play sports on the Sabbath day, which is Saturday for Shemitic Israelite culture, but it is Sunday for a Catholic Christian culture. All right, so let's read this real quick. The Book of Sports. The Catholics were trying to change the Sabbath day from Saturday to Sunday, so they began to forbid the people from playing sports and working on Sunday. The people petitioned King James concerning sports on Sunday, if they were biblically forbidden to play or not. King James VI of Scotland and his son, Charles I, passed laws legalizing sports on Sunday. So what this had right here is the Catholic Church was saying the Sabbath day is Sunday. King James was saying it was Saturday. So he allowed the people to play sports on Sunday. So that means that he was acknowledging the Sabbath day as Saturday. All right. So King James and the Stewarts, the Sabbath day or the day of rest for them was Saturday. The Catholic Christians, the rest of the day of rest for them was Sunday. So as you can already see, there's a difference between the Stewart culture and the Catholic culture. All right. So right here, what we have is a picture of John Smith. All right. Captain John Smith. So a lot of us are familiar with that story Pocahontas that was put out by Disney. And in that movie, they show us this Caucasian man that they call John Smith. But historically, that is inaccurate because the original Captain John Smith was a Highlander or a Scot. And that's a picture of him that you see right there in front of you. All right. So that is the original Captain John Smith, who came to Virginia to help set up what's known as the Virginia Company. OK. And that's a picture of him right here, Captain John Smith. So he was a melanated Scot. All right. Also, too, when they talk about New England, really, New England and Virginia is the same. So a lot of times when they talk about New England, they're talking about the eastern seaboard. And when they talk about Virginia, they're not even talking about just the quote unquote state of Virginia today. It was a lot more land than just that. So that's why on this picture right here of Captain John Smith, it says New England, but it's showing you Virginia. All right. So think about how we have the football team here called the New England Patriots, and they're located in Boston, Massachusetts, or the eastern seaboard. All right. So New England actually is America in a way, you know. All right. Once again, another picture of Admiral of New England, the portrait of Captain John Smith. So this is Captain John Smith, the man that married into the family of Pocahontas. And her father was Chief Powhatan. So not only was Pocahontas a melanated indigenous American woman, but Captain John Smith was a Moorish melanated man from Scotland. And this is him. Now, were some of this, land, was it some of this land confiscated and stolen through warfare? Yes. So just keep in mind that when these Europeans came here, the land was either leased or rented out in a business contract, or they stole it in war. All right. And this was melanated people, or so-called black people, going against so-called black people. Black Americans going against black Europeans. So that's Captain John Smith. And this is just a close picture. So this is a close picture of Captain John Smith, the melanated Highlander from Scotland. All right. This is the Caucasian paled wild man descendant image of Captain John Smith, a false image. So this actually is how the wild people of Europa looked after they came in, kicked out all the original people who were ruling and living in the castles, stole their clothes, learned how to speak English, French, etc. Started practicing Christianity. This is them. But the original people were there, looked like this. All right. So I just wanted to go into that history. Go into the history of the lepers, go into the history of the kings of the Scots, the 100 Years' War, the War of 1812, and just help, put the history in context so you can understand, at least from the Moorish nobility side that you may have from Europa, what they dealt with and what led them to want to come to the Americas. But you all stay tuned for the next classic. Salute. Oh, one more thing. Let's see. Before we move forward. So this is how the original Americans look. We've shown pictures like this in the past, but before we end it, just know that when these, Scots just came here, they was coming here and intermarrying with melanated people. So Pocahontas and her father and her people, they look like this. All right. So as you can see, this says original Floridian Indian. Here is a Floridian American emperor or Indian from 1723. All right. As you can see on his little sign, it says Florida. So America and Florida, that's the same name. So here's a Floridian or American king from 1723. Here is a Floridian or American king from the 19th century or the 1800s. And as you can see, he's wearing the cap of liberty or the Phrygian cap or the fez. All right. And he's a king of America. Here is another king of America or another Floridian emperor or king dated from 1671. All right. So I just wanted you to see that. And these were people of color, melanated